She counted them out loud as she walked through the gate. 1. The baby on her hip, 10 months old, squirming against the cold. 2. A girl of 7 gripping the hem of Eliza's coat with both fists. 3. A boy of 6 dragging a canvas sack across the frozen dirt. 4. The oldest, 9 years old, jaw set, eyes on the man standing at the porch steps like he was already measuring the distance back to the road. The rancher hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just stood there with his arms loose at his sides, watching this woman count her children like she was counting reasons he should turn her away. Eliza Monroe stopped 10 feet from Caleb Whitaker and said it plain. 4 children, none of them yours. I have no money, no land, and nobody left to go back to. She shifted the baby to her other hip. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't dress it up. You deserve to know what you're looking at before either of us says another word. She had learned to say it that way. Fast and flat, like pulling a splinter. Better to get it over with than to drag out the hoping. She watched his face, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the man standing in front of her didn't look away. If this story moves you, stay with us until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. The wagon that brought Eliza Monroe to the edge of Caleb Whitaker's property had belonged to a freight driver named Hollis, who charged her 3 weeks of laundering work for the ride. He hadn't been unkind exactly, but he hadn't been warm either, and when he pulled the horses to a stop at the fence line and nodded toward the distant shape of a house, he said, "That's the Whitaker place," and waited with the particular patience of a man who expected to be back on the road inside of 5 minutes. Eliza had climbed down from the wagon bench without help and lifted Rose from the flatbed. Thomas had jumped down on his own. Clara had needed a hand, which Thomas had given her because Thomas was 6 and already seemed to understand that small dignities mattered. Samuel had come last, landing with both feet and straightening his coat in one motion, and then standing beside the wagon like he was deciding whether to get back in. "Thank you," Eliza told the driver. He tipped his hat and turned the horses without another word. She stood there in the cold Wyoming air and looked at the gate. Beyond it, a long dirt path cut through land that was flat and wide and unforgiving. The kind of land that didn't care what you'd left behind. The kind that only asked what you intended to do next. "Mama," Clara said, tucking herself against Eliza's side. "I know," Eliza said, though she didn't explain what she knew. She shifted Rose again and started walking. The ranch was larger than she'd expected. She could see that even before she reached the house, the outbuildings, the fenced pasture, the barn with its clean lines and solid construction. Whoever built this place had done it right. That was something. A man who built things right tended to mean it when he built them. She had exchanged 5 letters with Caleb Whitaker over the course of 3 months. The first letter had been formal, almost stiff, written in a hand that pressed too hard on the paper. He was a rancher, 34 years old, widowed, no children, looking for a companion and a partner in the practical sense. He had not used words like romance or love. He had said honest things. The winters were hard. The work was constant. He did not expect easy. She had appreciated that. Her own first letter back had been honest and kind. She was 29, widowed herself, capable of hard work, experienced with livestock and gardens, and the particular arithmetic of making less stretch into enough. She had mentioned her children in that first letter. She had written, "I have children from my marriage. I want you to know this from the beginning." She had not said how many. She had told herself it was because the number felt like something that should be said in person, where she could see his face and he could see that they were real children, not abstractions, not problems on a ledger, but small people with names and habits and the ability to make a grown man laugh even when he didn't intend to. But the truth was simpler and less flattering than that. She hadn't said how many because she was afraid. The second letter from Caleb had said he understood she had children and that he had no objection. The third had included a rough description of the property and a question about whether she was comfortable with horses. The fourth had been practical, travel arrangements, which town to arrive at, who to ask for directions. The fifth had been short, almost terse. "I'll be at the ranch. Come when you're ready." Not warm, but not cold either, just direct. She had climbed into Hollis's wagon telling herself that direct was enough, that a man who built things right and spoke plainly and didn't dress up his words with promises he couldn't keep, was exactly the kind of man worth crossing 600 miles for. She had climbed into that wagon not knowing if she believed it. And now she was standing at his gate with 4 children behind her and a rancher on his porch steps who had gone very still. Eliza walked. The children walked behind her. Rose had quieted against her shoulder, either asleep or close to it, the way babies sometimes went calm in the cold, as if the air itself had soothed them. Thomas stayed close to Clara. Samuel walked several paces back, separate, which was his way. He had been that way since his father died, keeping a distance that allowed him to watch without being watched. Caleb Whitaker came down the porch steps when they were about 30 feet out. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by years outside. He wore no hat, which surprised her. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His expression was something she couldn't immediately read. Not welcoming, not hostile, just careful. Like a man waiting for the full picture before he decided anything. She stopped 10 feet from him and counted her children, out loud. Because she had learned that lesson already, paid for it already, and she was done learning it again. 4 children, none of them yours. I have no money, no land, and nobody left to go back to. She looked at him straight. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't dress it up. You deserve to know what you're looking at before either of us says another word. A gust came off the open ground and pushed between them. Somewhere in the barn, a horse moved. Rose stirred and made a small, unhappy sound and went quiet again. Caleb Whitaker looked at her. Then he looked at the children behind her, Thomas, Clara, Samuel, and then at the baby in her arms. He took his time. He did not rush it. Then he said, 4 is more than I was expecting. I know. You didn't say 4 in your letters. No, she said. I didn't. He was quiet for a moment. A long moment. The kind of moment that had ended things before. The kind where she could feel the calculation happening behind a man's eyes. The arithmetic of cost and effort and inconvenience and doubt. And then the careful construction of a sentence that meant no while trying to sound like I'm sorry. She had heard that sentence so many times she could have written it for him. But Caleb Whitaker said something different. Are they hungry? Eliza blinked. What? The children. He looked past her again. Are they hungry? It's past noon, and it's cold, and you've been traveling. I've got stew on. She stood there for a moment that felt strangely long. Then she said, Yes, they're hungry. All right, he said, and turned back toward the house. That was it. No declaration, no speech. No moment of visible generosity that would later be retold at a dinner table as the day he became a better man. He just turned and walked back up the porch steps and held the door open. Eliza looked at her children. Thomas was already looking at her with a question on his face. Clara had pressed herself closer. Samuel, 10 feet back, was watching Caleb's retreating figure with the flat, measuring look of a boy who had learned that a man's first action was never the one that counted. Come on, Eliza said, and she followed the rancher into the house. The inside of the house was not what she'd expected, and she was already revising her expectations of Caleb Whitaker faster than she'd revised them for anyone. It was clean. Not the scrubbed, performative cleanliness of a man who'd tidied in anticipation of company, but the functional order of someone who lived with themselves long enough to develop habits. The floors were bare wood, worn smooth. The walls were plain. A single shelf near the door held a hat, a pair of work gloves, and nothing else. But the table. The table stopped her. It was long, longer than it needed to be for a single man. A solid piece of work in dark wood with 6 chairs arranged around it. 6. Not 4. Not the practical 2-chair table of a man who ate alone and knew it. 6 chairs, evenly spaced, as if someone had set the table for a family that hadn't arrived yet. Eliza looked at it for a moment longer than she should have. Caleb had gone to the stove. He moved around his own kitchen with the efficiency of a man who cooked because he had to, not because he liked it, pulling a pot forward, finding bowls on a shelf. He didn't offer commentary on the house or the furnishings or what she might think of them. Sit wherever, he said, without turning around. Clara immediately went to the chair closest to the window, the way children claim things without understanding they're claiming them. Thomas sat beside her. Rose, awakened by the warmth of the house, began to fuss, and Eliza shifted her and bounced her gently. Samuel sat at the far end of the table, the seat farthest from Caleb, his back straight and his eyes moving around the room the way they always did in new places, cataloging exits, assessing the angles, doing the quiet work of a child who had appointed himself the family's early warning system. Caleb brought bowls to the table without ceremony. Beef stew, thick, with root vegetables and bread that was a day old but still solid. He set a bowl in front of each child, and then one in front of Eliza, and then one at his own place, which was at the head of the table, and he sat down, and there were still 2 empty chairs. Nobody said grace. She noticed that about him immediately. No performance, no ritual, just the plain act of eating because it was time to eat. Thomas had his spoon in the bowl before Caleb had even settled in his chair. Clara was more cautious, watching the soup as if it might require an introduction. Rose accepted a spoonful from Eliza and seemed to find it acceptable. Samuel ate with his eyes down, methodical, taking small bites, the kind of eating that didn't look like hunger even when it was. "Where'd you come from?" Caleb said. Not a question, really. More like something he was saying to fill the particular silence of strangers eating together. "Kansas, originally," Eliza said. "We've been in Missouri the past 2 years. Long trip." "Yes." "You manage all right on the train with them?" "We managed." He nodded. His attention moved briefly to Thomas, who had finished his stew and was looking at the bread with the transparent longing of a 6-year-old who didn't know yet that it was acceptable to ask for more. "Go ahead," Caleb said. Just those 2 words, directed at Thomas. Thomas looked up, surprised. Then he reached for the bread. It was such a small thing. It was the kind of thing a person could miss if they were watching for larger gestures. But Eliza didn't miss it. He showed her around the ranch after the children had eaten. It was a practical tour. Here's the barn. Here's where the water comes from in winter. Here's what breaks first when the freeze sets in. He talked about the property the way a man described a contract, accurately, without sentiment, noting the terms clearly so there would be no dispute later. "The house has 2 bedrooms," he said. They were standing in the hallway. "I've been sleeping in the smaller one. You and the baby can have the larger. The older 3 can share." "That's fine." "There's a straw tick in the barn I can move up if they need more sleeping room." "They're used to close quarters." He nodded. He was looking at the wall, not at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. The directness of it caught her off guard. "Do what?" "Any of it." He turned finally and looked at her with something that was either honesty or tiredness, possibly both. "I built this place thinking it would be full. And then it wasn't, and I got used to that, I think, more than I realized, so I don't know how this is supposed to go." "Neither do I," she said. "That's something, at least." "Is it?" "Better than one of us pretending." She couldn't argue with that. The first week was careful. Not hostile, careful. The way you are around something unfamiliar that you don't yet know how to hold. Eliza set her own rhythms without being asked. Up before the children, the kitchen straightened before Caleb came down from wherever he'd slept. Because she understood that a man who lived alone long enough developed a relationship with his own mornings that felt personal, almost private, and she didn't want to disrupt his before he decided she was allowed to. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. The second morning, she was at the stove when Caleb came through the door from outside, already back from the barn, his coat carrying the cold in with him, and he stopped when he saw the coffee and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. He poured a cup and stood at the window and drank it. Then he said, "I'll show you where the chickens are this morning." "All right." "Thomas'll want to come." She turned. "How did you know that?" "He asked me yesterday if he could help with the animals." Caleb set down the cup. Said it like I might say no, so I said yes. She hadn't known that. Thomas hadn't told her. The fact of it sat with her while she cracked eggs into the pan. Her 6-year-old son, who had spent 18 months being extra quiet in rooms where men were deciding whether to stay, had walked up to this stranger and asked if he could help with the animals. Something in that frightened her a little, the ease of it, the wanting, because she knew from experience that wanting was the thing that hurt the most when it came apart. Clara brought her drawings out on the 4th day. She had been keeping them in the canvas sack she'd carried off the wagon, rolled up and wrapped in a piece of oilcloth she'd been given by a woman on the train. They were drawings done in pencil and in places with colored chalk. animals, mostly, and landscapes, and in one case a long detailed picture of a house with a garden in front of it that bore no resemblance to any house Clara had ever actually lived in. She put them on the table without announcing it, just spread them out like she was laying cards, and waited. Caleb came in from outside and stopped. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at the drawings for a long moment. Clara stood on the other side of the table, watching him with the particular intensity of a child who has put something real in front of a person and is waiting to see if that person knows what it is. "These are yours," he said. "Yes." "All of them?" "Yes." He picked up the one with the house and the garden. He held it at arm's length, then closer. "How old are you?" 7. He set the drawing down. He looked at Clara. He said, "There's a shop in town that sells drawing paper, real drawing paper, not the back of ledger sheets. Next time I go in, I'll bring some back." Clara looked at him. "If you want it," he added, like an afterthought, but not quite. "Yes," Clara said, very quiet. "All right." He went back outside. Clara looked at her drawings still spread across the table, and then she picked them up one by one and re-rolled them in the oilcloth, and she was almost certainly smiling, though she kept her face turned down. Eliza had watched the whole thing from the doorway and did not say a word about it to either of them. The trouble with Rose was simpler and more immediate. Rose was 10 months old and did not yet understand the concept of appropriate timing. She slept badly. She was restless in unfamiliar rooms and cried at hours that had no logic. Not the crying of hunger or pain, but the crying of a baby who had not decided yet whether this new place was safe. The second night she cried for 2 hours. Eliza walked her, rocked her, tried everything, and when she finally resorted to walking the hallway because movement sometimes helped, she rounded the corner and found Caleb standing in his doorway in the dark, watching. "Sorry," she said immediately. "I'm so sorry. She doesn't usually—" "She's fine," he said. "I'll take her outside. She might—" "It's freezing outside." He came out of his doorway. "Give her to me." She stared at him. "I'm not sleeping anyway," he said. "Give her to me." Eliza hesitated for a fraction of a second that contained about 6 different objections, and then she handed Rose to him. He held the baby with the stiff, overcautious grip of a man who hadn't held an infant in a very long time, maybe ever, and who knew he was doing it wrong but was committed to figuring it out. He walked to the window at the end of the hall and stood there, swaying slightly, with Rose against his chest, and he looked out at the dark ranch and said nothing. Rose went quiet within 10 minutes. Not immediately, not magically. She fussed, and then settled, and then fussed again, and then, apparently, decided he was acceptable, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. Caleb stood at that window for another 20 minutes, not moving, as if he was afraid the stillness would break. Eliza went back to bed. She lay there in the dark and listened to the silence in the hallway. The particular silence of a baby sleeping against someone who wasn't her mother. And she felt something shift inside her chest that she couldn't name and wasn't ready to examine. Samuel was the problem she didn't know how to solve. Not because he was difficult in an obvious way. He was quiet, respectful. He did what was asked of him and he stayed out of the way. But he watched Caleb the way he watched everything, steadily, from a distance, filing information. Eliza had seen that watching before. She'd seen it in the months after his father died, when Samuel was 7 years old, and suddenly started noticing everything adults did and said in a way that children weren't supposed to notice. He had been cataloging the world ever since, building a private case file of who could be trusted and who eventually left. The verdict on Caleb Whitaker was still pending. She tried to talk to him about it once, at the end of the first week, when he was sitting on the porch steps waiting for her to finish putting the younger ones to bed. "You could talk to him," she said. Samuel looked at the dark. "He's not what you think he is." "You don't know what I think," Samuel said. "Then tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had that particular flat tone he used when he was being careful. "People do nice things when they want you to stay. And then when something gets hard, they remember they didn't have to do any of it, and they leave." She sat down beside him on the step. "I'm not saying he's bad," Samuel said. "I'm saying we don't know." "That's true," she said. "We don't." "So why are you acting like we do?" She didn't have a good answer for that. Because hope was not evidence. Because wanting something to be true had never, in her experience, made it true. Because she was her son's mother and she was doing the same dangerous thing he was warning her against, letting herself lean in before she knew if the ground would hold. She put her arm around him and he let her, which was its own kind of answer set. On the 9th day, something small happened that she didn't understand until later. She was in the barn, doing the afternoon feeding with Thomas, when she heard Caleb's voice through the wall of the adjacent stall. He was talking to one of the horses, not the careful, demonstrative talking of someone who knew he was being observed, but the absent, low-grade muttering of a man who had been talking to horses for years because it was better than silence. She caught pieces of it. The horse's name, a comment about the weather, something about a fence line, and then, quietly, almost as if he hadn't meant to say it out loud, 4. I was not ready for 4. She stood very still. But they're good kids, he said, in the same absent tone. A pause. She's not what I expected either. Another pause. Not bad. Just not what I expected. Thomas looked up at her from where he was filling the hay rack. His face said, "Should we not be hearing this?" She put her finger to her lips. They finished the feeding in silence, and she thought about those words for the rest of the day, turning them the way you turn a stone over. Not sure what's underneath, but knowing there's something. 4. I was not ready for 4. She hadn't been ready either. She hadn't been ready for any of it. For the letters, for the trip, for the table with 6 chairs, for a man who told a hungry child to go ahead and take the bread. She hadn't been ready for what it felt like to hand him her baby in the dark hallway and have him stand there without complaint until Rose stopped crying. She hadn't been ready for any of it. But here she was. And the ground, so far, was holding. She caught Samuel watching Caleb again that evening. They were all at the table, all 6 of them, 2 chairs empty, which was a different calculation than it had been when she arrived. And Caleb was cutting Thomas's bread into pieces because Thomas had asked, and it was such an ordinary domestic gesture that it barely registered until she noticed Samuel looking. Not with hostility, not with the hard, measuring assessment she was used to, just looking. Like a boy who was beginning, very slowly, against his own better judgment, to believe that the calculation might come out different this time. She looked down at her bowl. She told herself not to lean on that. Told herself not to take it as a sign of anything. Told herself the ground could still give way tomorrow, or next week, or whenever the first real hard thing arrived, which it always did. The first winter storm, the first financial shortage, the first moment when the inconvenience of 4 children stopped being manageable and started being real. She told herself all of that. And she ate her supper. And across the table, Caleb was telling Thomas something about horses, something technical, probably more detail than a 6-year-old needed. And Thomas was listening with his whole body, turned toward this man like a plant toward light. And Eliza watched her son and felt the thing in her chest that she still couldn't name and still wasn't ready to examine. She told herself she wasn't leaning, but she had stopped counting the distance to the door. The ground held through the first 2 weeks. That was the thing Eliza kept waiting to stop being true, and kept being surprised to find was still true. Every morning she came downstairs and found the house in the same shape she'd left it. The fire banked, the water brought in, the day already started by a man who got up before the sun without making a production of it. She had lived in enough uncertain situations to know that stability was not the same as permanence, that a thing could hold for 14 days and then fail spectacularly on the 15th. She knew that. She reminded herself of it regularly, and she went on doing the work of each day because that was all there was to do. Caleb had settled into something like a pattern with the children, though settled was probably too intentional a word for it. It was more that he had stopped adjusting and started just acting, the way a man does when he finally accepts that a new element in his environment is not temporary. He no longer spoke to Thomas with the slight formality of an adult addressing someone else's child. He spoke to him the way you speak to someone who is simply there, directly, with the assumption that the answer will come back and that it will probably involve horses. Thomas had become, over the course of 2 weeks, deeply and completely horse-obsessed in the way that only 6-year-old boys can manage, where the obsession fills every available corner of their consciousness and begins leaking out in every conversation, regardless of how the conversation started. "I think Juniper likes me better than the other horses," Thomas announced at breakfast one morning. "Juniper doesn't like anyone," Caleb said, not looking up from his coffee. "She let me touch her nose." "She let me touch her nose the first week I had her too," Then she bit me. Thomas considered this with the gravity of someone receiving important professional advice. So she was testing you. She was biting me. Maybe it's a test. Caleb looked up. There was something that might have been amusement at the corner of his mouth, though it hadn't committed to being there yet. Maybe, he said. Don't let her bite you. I won't, Thomas said, with the absolute confidence of a boy who fully intended to let her try. Eliza ate her eggs and said nothing and stored that exchange in the same place she stored all the others. A private collection of small moments she didn't know what to do with yet, but couldn't bring herself to discard. Clara had her drawing paper. Caleb had brought it back from town the previous Saturday, a thick sheaf of good cream-colored stock, and had set it on the table without ceremony, the way he did most things. Claire had looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up, then looked at him, then said thank you in a voice that was almost too quiet to hear. Caleb had said, "Yep," and gone back outside. The drawings were already filling the paper. Clara worked on them at the table in the afternoon when the light came through the window at the right angle, her tongue pressed to her upper lip, her pencil moving in long, confident strokes that looked too assured for a 7-year-old's hand. She drew horses, mostly, though one afternoon Eliza came in from the yard to find a careful, detailed rendering of the barn taking shape on the page. And on another occasion she found what was unmistakably a portrait of Rose, asleep in the wooden box they'd arranged as a cradle near the stove. "Can I keep it?" Eliza asked. Clara looked up, considered. "I was going to make it better first. Make it better, and then let me keep it." "All right." She did, and Eliza folded it carefully and put it in the small cedar box where she kept the few things she'd carried from Missouri that mattered. A lock of her husband Daniel's hair. The marriage certificate, faded now and soft at the folds. 2 letters from her own mother, dead 6 years. And now a pencil drawing of her youngest daughter sleeping, done by her middle child on paper that a near stranger had bought without being asked. She didn't examine what it meant to put it there. She just put it there. Rose, for her part, had completed her assessment of Caleb Whitaker and returned a verdict that the rest of the family had not yet reached. She had decided he was fine. She had in fact decided he was more than fine, in the particular way of babies who attach themselves to the adults who hold them when they're crying without making a fuss about it. She reached for him when he came near. She grabbed his finger when he walked past the cradle. On 2 occasions, Eliza had come into the kitchen to find Rose in the crook of Caleb's arm while he ate his breakfast one-handed, doing it with the resigned competence of a man who had decided that this was apparently what breakfast was now. He didn't comment on it, neither did she. They were both, she realized, very good at not commenting on things, at letting situations exist without narrativizing them, without forcing them into a shape that had to be declared and therefore could be disputed. She found that quality in him deeply reassuring and also, occasionally, deeply frustrating, because there were things that needed to be said. She knew that. Things that living together in close quarters would eventually surface whether they were addressed directly or not. Questions about how decisions got made, about what she was allowed to do without asking, about what the children could expect and from whom, about what this was exactly, what they were building, whether they were building anything at all or just surviving side by side in the same house and calling it marriage. She had not said any of those things yet. She was waiting for the right moment, which was the same thing she always did, which was why she'd spent 3 months exchanging careful letters with a man she'd never met instead of finding some way to actually talk to anyone about what her life had become. It was the chairs that finally started to change things. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing was dramatic with Caleb, which was both a relief and an occasional source of genuine irritation, but in the slow, incremental way that things change when you stop pretending they're not changing. The table had 6 chairs. For the first days, only 4 of them were used, Caleb at the head, Eliza at his right, Clara and Thomas beside her. Samuel sat at the far end, separated by 2 empty chairs, and the baby was in the cradle near the stove. Then Rose began demanding to be at the table. Not asking, demanding, in the specific, inarticulate, absolutely non-negotiable way of babies approaching their first birthday, making it clear through sheer persistence that the cradle was unacceptable, and whatever everyone else was doing was what she intended to be doing also. Caleb had built something to solve the problem. Eliza came in one afternoon to find him at the workbench in the barn with pieces of wood and a look of moderate concentration, and when she asked what he was making, he said chair, in a tone that indicated the question had not really needed to be asked. 2 days later, there was a high chair at the table, solid and a little rough at the edges, but functional, and Rose sat in it at dinner and slapped the tray and seemed satisfied with the situation. 5 of the 6 chairs were now occupied. She noticed Samuel look at the empty one on the evening the high chair appeared. Just a glance, brief, sideways, the kind that you make when you think no one is watching. Then he looked back at his plate and went on eating. She didn't say anything. The next morning, Samuel came down before his siblings, which was unusual. He stood in the kitchen doorway while Eliza was at the stove, and he said, "Is there something I can do?" Not a question exactly. More like an offer, the hesitant kind that expects to be declined. "Barn needs water brought up," she said. He went and did it without another word. When Caleb came in from the early feeding and saw the water already brought, and Samuel at the table with his hands around a cup of warmed milk, he said nothing about it, just sat down. But he moved the cup slightly out of the way of his elbow in a way that was oddly companionable, the casual consideration of someone acknowledging another person's presence. And Samuel watched that small adjustment with those cataloging eyes of his and went on drinking his milk. Eliza put plates on the table and thought, something is moving. She couldn't have said exactly what. She just felt it, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the quality of the air before it, when the world has not yet decided what's going to happen, but has clearly decided that something will. The first real argument happened on a Thursday. Not between Caleb and Eliza, between Eliza and the situation. She had gone into town with Clara and Thomas, while Samuel stayed on the ranch with the baby, and by extension, with Caleb. The errand was practical: flour, lamp oil, a spool of black thread she needed. The town was called Harlow, which was not much of a town but had a general store and a livery and a church and a sufficient number of residents to constitute a social world with opinions. She felt those opinions in the general store. The woman behind the counter was named Martha Greer, and she was not unfriendly. She was the opposite of unfriendly in the very specific way of a person who has a great deal to say and is currently selecting among her options. She helped Eliza find the flour and the thread and asked where she'd come from, and when Eliza told her Missouri and mentioned the Whitaker Ranch, something shifted in Martha Greer's expression. Not hostility, more like the particular alertness of a woman who considers herself the unofficial record keeper of a community and has just received a new piece of information to file. "Caleb Whitaker's place," she said. "Yes." "You're the bride, then?" "I suppose I am." Martha Greer looked at Clara and Thomas, who were standing quietly by the bolt cloth, touching nothing because Eliza had told them to touch nothing. "2 children," she said. "4," Eliza said. "2 are at the ranch." The silence that followed was brief but complete. "4," Martha Greer said. "4." There was a beat. Another woman near the back of the store had gone very still in the way of someone who is listening carefully while performing the act of not listening. "Well," Martha Greer said finally, and the word contained a remarkable amount of information. "Caleb is a patient man." "He is," Eliza said. She paid for her things. She kept her voice level. She took her children's hands and walked out into the cold air and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment before she started toward where the wagon was tied. Clara looked up at her. "That lady didn't like us." "She didn't know us," Eliza said. "Same thing," Clara said, with the blunt clarity of a 7-year-old. Eliza didn't correct her. She drove home with the flour and the lamp oil and the thread and a cold thing sitting in her chest that she identified, after a while, as something between anger and exhaustion. She had known this would happen. She had known the moment she counted her children at Caleb's gate that the counting would happen in other places too, by other people, with the same particular arithmetic, the math of women who were considered to have exceeded some invisible allowance. Too many children, too much to ask, too much weight for any reasonable man to choose. She had known it. It still landed. She got back to the ranch and unloaded the supplies and put them away and fed Rose, and then she went to the back of the yard where the kitchen garden would become spring and stood there in the cold for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just being outside of the house and away from everyone. She heard the door, then Caleb's footsteps on the frozen ground. He came to stand beside her. Not behind her, not at a careful distance. Beside her, looking at the same section of dead garden. Town was fine, he said. Town was fine. A pause. Martha Greer has opinions, he said. She looked at him. She has opinions about most things, he said. Has for as long as I've lived here. People mostly take it as weather. It's just what it does. It still does something when it lands. I know. He was quiet for a moment. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter, or that people will get used to it right away. Some of them won't. He looked at the garden. But the ones that do the actual work around here, Hendricks at the feed store, the Larsons 2 miles north, Doc Parsons, they're different. They're the ones that matter when it counts. She looked at him for a long moment. Did people say things to you before I arrived? Some. What kind of things? He seemed to consider how much honesty to apply. That it was a lot to take on. That a mail-order situation with children involved had a high chance of not lasting. That I should have been clear in the letters about what I was looking for. They weren't wrong about the letters, she said. No, he said. They weren't. Are they right about the rest? He turned and looked at her directly, the way he had done at the gate on the first day. Fully, taking his time. I'm still here, he said. So are you. That's more than some arrangements get to in 3 weeks. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact, offered with the same directness he applied to everything, and it shouldn't have steadied her the way it did. She turned back to the dead garden. Come spring, I want to plant this properly. Vegetables and some herbs. There's good soil under the frost, he said. It grows. All right. They went back inside. They did not touch. They did not say anything further about Martha Greer or the opinions of Harlow or what the arrangement was or wasn't. But when they came through the door, Thomas immediately attached himself to Caleb's side, wanting to know something about Juniper. And Rose put her arms up from the cradle, and Clara looked up from her drawing with the absent, evaluating look of an artist checking the light. And Samuel, at the far end of the room, watched Eliza come in, and something in his posture eased by a degree so small that no one would have noticed it, who wasn't looking for exactly that. Eliza noticed. The thing she had not told Caleb, the thing she hadn't told anyone since leaving Missouri, was the full story of why she'd left, not the surface story. The surface story was true enough. Her husband Daniel had died of a fever the previous winter, 18 months after their youngest was born, and without his wages they couldn't keep the room they were renting, and there were no family members in any proximity who were positioned to help, and the options available to a woman with 4 children and no land and no income in Missouri in 1883 were not extensive. That part was true. What she hadn't said was that she'd had another option, and she'd turned it down. Daniel's brother, Roy Monroe, had come to her 3 months after the funeral with an offer that he'd presented as charitable and that she'd understood from the first sentence for what it was, not charity, but purchase. He would take her and the children into his house, where his wife had died 2 years prior, and she would run the household, and he would provide the income, and they would call it helping family. He had not mentioned marriage, which was either gentlemanly restraint or a specific calculation about how much he'd have to offer in exchange for what he wanted, and she had never been sure which. She had said no. Roy Monroe had said he was disappointed. He had said 4 children was a significant responsibility, and she should think carefully about what alternatives existed. He had said it in the way of a man who was explaining gravity, not threatening, just informing her of conditions she would eventually be forced to accept. She had said no again. She had spent the following 6 weeks in a room she could no longer really afford, trading labor for rent and sewing what she could, and writing letters to the agencies that facilitated the practical arrangements between women who needed options and men in the West who needed wives. She had not been romantic about it. She had understood it as a transaction and had tried to approach it as one, and she had very specifically tried not to let herself imagine that it would be anything else. And then she'd arrived at a gate in Wyoming, and a man with a weathered face and needs-cutting hair had looked at her 4 children and asked if they were hungry. She hadn't told Caleb any of this. She had told him the version that was true, but not complete. Widowed, no alternatives, Missouri. She had not told him about Roy. She had not told him about the offer, or the 2 refusals, or the specific quality of humiliation that came with knowing that the only proposals available to you were not about you at all, but about the inconvenient logistics of what came with you. She didn't know if she would ever tell him. She didn't know if it was his to know. But it lived in her, that story, the way unprocessed things live, not forgotten, just filed somewhere that was not convenient to access and not safe to ignore. Os. It was Samuel who found the table. Or rather, it was Samuel who asked about it first, which amounted to the same thing, because Samuel's questions were never casual. He didn't ask things to make conversation. He asked things because he'd already been thinking about them for a while and had decided he needed more information. He and Caleb had been in the barn on a Saturday afternoon. Eliza had noticed Samuel gravitating toward the barn when Caleb was working there, never exactly offering to help, just appearing in the vicinity, the way you move toward warmth without quite admitting you're cold. Caleb had started giving him small things to do, coiling rope, checking hinges. Nothing significant, nothing that required trust, just tasks that made the presence of a 9-year-old useful rather than merely tolerated. She heard about the conversation later from Thomas, who had also been in the barn and had the 9-year-old's gift of perfect recall for conversations that were not primarily about horses. Samuel had asked, apparently without preamble, "Why is the table so big?" Caleb had been repairing a harness. "Built it that way," he'd said. "But it's just you," Samuel said. A pause. "Was just me," Caleb said. "But when you built it, it was just you." Caleb had kept working on the harness for a moment. Then he'd said, "I built it for the family I thought I was going to have." Samuel was quiet. Then, "What happened to them?" "My wife died, before we had any children." Another quiet. Thomas, at this point, per his own account, had stopped what he was doing and was attempting to become part of the wall. "So you built 6 chairs for a family that never came," Samuel said. "Yes." "That's—" Samuel stopped. "Go ahead," Caleb said. "That's a sad thing to do." "It is," Caleb said. "I thought about taking some of the chairs out. Seemed like it would be worse, though, having fewer chairs because I needed fewer. At least with 6, there was still something to work toward." The silence that followed, according to Thomas, lasted a while. Then Samuel said, "There's only one empty one now." "There is," Caleb said. "Rose is going to need a regular chair eventually, when she's older." "That's right." "Right. So there won't be any empty ones." Caleb apparently just said, "Doesn't look like it." Thomas said that Samuel didn't say anything after that, just went back to coiling rope. Eliza heard this story standing at the kitchen window, listening to Thomas tell it with the slightly breathless quality of someone who understood they had witnessed something but wasn't sure exactly what. She listened to the whole thing, and then she sent Thomas back outside and stood at the window alone for a long moment. At least with 6, there was still something to work toward. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window, and she felt the cold come through it, and she thought about a man spending years alone at a table built for 6. And she thought about a woman spending years counting the ways her children made her impossible to love. And she thought about the strange geometry of 2 losses that turned out to fit each other. She didn't say anything about it to Caleb that night, or the next night, but she started leaving his coffee on the right side of the stove where it stayed warm longer, and she stopped arranging the children's things to be invisible, and she started, very slowly, very quietly, letting the house belong to all of them. Rose said her first real word on a Tuesday. She had been building toward language the way babies do, sounds that almost meant things, consonants that almost resolved into words, the general impression of communication without the specifics. Eliza had been watching for it, the way she'd watched for it with all of them, that first clear verbal landing. She missed it. She was in the kitchen garden, measuring for where the beds would go come spring, when it happened. She came inside 20 minutes later to find Clara and Thomas at the table and Caleb standing near the cradle. Rose had moved to a proper crib by now, the cradle too small, with an expression on his face she hadn't seen before. "What?" she said. "She said a word," Clara said. Eliza looked at the baby, who was looking at Caleb with evident satisfaction. "What word?" Thomas was already grinning. Clara said, "Da." The room was very quiet. "She's been saying Naima for weeks," Eliza said, because she needed to say something. "Not da," Clara said. "She said da." She pointed at Caleb. At him. Caleb had the look of a man who was managing several simultaneous feelings with insufficient preparation. He looked at Eliza, and the look was complicated. Not triumphant, not uncomfortable, just complicated, layered, the look of a person to whom something has happened that they cannot immediately categorize. Babies do that, Eliza said. They say sounds and they don't mean, "Da," Rose said, clearly, looking directly at Caleb. Eliza stopped. Clara looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Eliza. Samuel, from the doorway where he had apparently appeared at some point, was looking at Caleb with those cataloging eyes. But the expression behind them was different now, or maybe different was not the right word. Softer, possibly, though that was not a word she associated with Samuel, and she wasn't sure she was reading it right. Caleb looked down at Rose. After a moment, he said very quietly, "Hey, kid." That was all. "Hey, kid." The same two words he'd used when Thomas knocked over a water pail, and he'd picked him up off the ground and checked for injuries. Two words that meant, "I see you. You're fine. We're fine." Rose grabbed his finger. Eliza stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and felt the unnamed thing in her chest become, for the first time, almost nameable. She turned around and went back out to the garden before anyone could see her face. She stood in the cold yard and looked at the frozen ground where in 2 months she would plant things, and she thought about all the careful distance she'd maintained. From the furniture, from the chairs, from the story Caleb had told Samuel in the barn, from the man himself, from the idea that this could be anything other than a practical arrangement between two people who'd run out of other options. She had been so careful. And her 10-month-old daughter, who had not been careful at all, had gone ahead and named him anyway. She stood there until the cold got into her coat. Then she went back inside and finished making supper, and nobody mentioned it again that evening, but the table felt different, and she thought Caleb probably felt it too, and she was no longer completely certain she was wrong to let herself feel it back. The winter arrived the way Wyoming winters always did, not as a single event, but as a slow, deliberate occupation, taking the land 1 degree at a time. Until one morning you looked out the window and the world had simply become a different place. November brought the first hard frost, and the frost brought the particular narrowing of ranch life that Eliza had not experienced before but recognized instinctively as serious. Caleb moved through it with the efficiency of a man who had survived it many times. Extra wood stacked against the south wall of the house. The animals shifted to the inner stalls. Water sources checked and rechecked. Supplies counted against the length of the season. He did not make speeches about it. He just did it, and what he couldn't do alone he organized, and what needed 2 sets of hands he asked for without apology. She gave them. That was the arrangement they'd arrived at without discussing it. She managed the house, and the children, and the cooking, and what portions of the outdoor work fell within her capacity. And he managed the ranch and the heavier labor and the decisions that required his particular knowledge of the land. And they overlapped in the middle, in ways that were sometimes awkward and sometimes not, and they were both too practical to pretend the arrangement was anything other than what it was. What it was working. That was the part she hadn't expected, or rather, she'd expected it might work in the bare minimum sense. That they would coexist without active disaster, that the children would be fed and sheltered, that she would carry her own weight, and he would not come to resent her for being there. She had not expected it to work in the fuller sense, the way something works when all the parts are actually suited to each other, when the friction is productive instead of destructive, when 2 people occupying the same space begin to make the space bigger instead of smaller. She thought about that on the morning she came down to find Caleb had already put oatmeal on the stove, because she'd mentioned the night before that she was tired, and he had, without comment or announcement, done something about it. It was such a small thing. The oatmeal was too thick and he'd used too much salt, and she'd fixed it without saying so, and neither of them mentioned any of it, and she stood at the stove thinking that she had been married before, to a man she'd genuinely loved, and Daniel had never once put oatmeal on the stove. She felt guilty for thinking it. She let herself think it anyway. Well, Samuel had started getting up early. Not as early as Caleb, who was up before the sky showed any intention of lightning, but earlier than the other children, earlier than Eliza. He would come downstairs in the dark with his boots already on, which she'd noticed because a 9-year-old who puts his boots on before coming downstairs has made a decision about where he's going, and she had not asked him about it directly because she understood that whatever was shifting in Samuel was shifting at its own pace, and any attempt to name it or hurry it would cause it to stop. She knew this from watching him his whole life. Samuel had always been the kind of child who approached change the way you approach out the door you're not sure about, standing at it for a while looking at the frame, listening for what's on the other side. Then, when he was ready, opening it without drama, as if he'd been sure all along. He was at the door. She didn't know if he was listening or ready. She just watched him come down in the early dark and go out to the barn, and she noted that Caleb never commented on Samuel's presence there. Not to her, not to Samuel himself. Just absorbed it into the morning routine the same way he'd absorbed everything else. One evening she asked Caleb quietly, when the children were in bed, "Is he in the way? Out there in the morning?" Caleb looked at her across the kitchen. "No. He doesn't talk much. Neither do I in the morning." She almost smiled at that. Is he doing all right, do you think, out there?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "He's careful," he said. "He watches everything before he tries it, doesn't rush into things." A pause. "That's not the worst way to be." She thought he was talking about more than barn work. "He asked me today why I checked the north fence first," Caleb said. "What did you tell him?" "That the north takes the worst of the wind, so it fails first. That you always check the thing most likely to fail before you need it." He looked at her. He thought about it for a bit, and then he said, "That makes sense. Like I'd passed something." "He's testing you," she said. "He's been testing you since the first day." "I know. Does that bother you?" Caleb picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "A kid who watches carefully and doesn't give trust until it's earned?" He shook his head slightly. "Where would he have learned that?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Clara's drawings had begun to appear on the walls. Not in any grand decorative gesture. Clara wasn't theatrical about it. She simply, one afternoon, took one of her finished drawings and held it against the wall near the window, looked at it, looked at Eliza, and said, "Can I?" Eliza had said, "Ask Caleb." Clara had waited until Caleb came in for supper, held the drawing against the same wall, and said, "Can I put this up?" Caleb had looked at it. The drawing was of Juniper, the horse, rendered in pencil with the particular focused confidence that Clara brought to all of it. The horse's head turned 3/4 toward the viewer with an expression that managed to be both accurate and slightly imperious. "She's going to be offended by that likeness," he said. Clara looked alarmed. "Is it wrong?" "No, it's right. That's exactly what she looks like. She'll be offended because she thinks she looks nicer." He picked up the hammer from the shelf near the door and drove a small nail into the wall. "There." Clara hung it and stepped back to look. Then she went and got a second drawing. "One at a time," Caleb said. "I just want to see how it looks with two." "One at a time," he said again, without heat, and Clara put the second drawing back. By the end of the following week, there were 4 drawings on the walls of the main room. Caleb had put up each nail without comment. Clara had treated the placement of each one with the seriousness of a matter of considerable importance. Eliza had watched the walls of the house slowly acquire something that looked, if you didn't examine it too closely, like the walls of a home that had been lived in for a long time by people who kept things. Thomas only noticed the drawings were there when he walked into one of Juniper's portraits with his face and said, with genuine alarm, "I thought she was in here." The snow came in the second week of December, and it meant what Caleb had said it would mean, a narrowing. The trips to town became difficult, and then inadvisable, and then stopped. The range of the world contracted to the house, the barn, the short distance between them, and the particular social universe of 5 people in close quarters, for whom the close quarters were still relatively new. The children handled it differently. Thomas barely noticed, because the barn remained accessible, and the barn contained Juniper, and therefore the barn contained everything Thomas needed from the world. Clara turned inward and spent most of the long evenings drawing, the scratch of her pencil a constant quiet background sound that Eliza eventually stopped hearing the way you stop hearing a clock. Rose, who had recently begun to pull herself upright on anything that would hold her, regarded the snow outside the window with intense suspicion, as if it were a new person who had arrived without an introduction. Samuel got quieter. He was always quiet, but this was a different register. Less the watchful quiet of a boy cataloging information, and more the inward quiet of one carrying something. She noticed it at the table first, the way he ate without the occasional sideways glances he'd been giving Caleb over the past weeks. The glances that said things were still being evaluated, but the evaluation was trending somewhere. Those glances stopped. He ate looking at his plate. He answered when spoken to and offered nothing extra. She tried to find the right moment to ask him about it. The right moment didn't present itself because the right moment with Samuel was never created. It was found, and it was found only when he was ready to be found. She kept watching. The problem declared itself on a Saturday when she went into town for supplies. She had gone with Caleb on one of the narrow windows between storms, leaving the children with strict instructions and a pot of soup on the stove that only needed not to be touched. Thomas was in charge, which Thomas found deeply satisfying and Samuel found insulting. But Thomas was the one who could be trusted not to make decisions, which was the actual requirement for the position. In town, she and Caleb went to Hendrix's feed store for the order they'd arranged the week prior. Hendrix was a compact, deliberate man in his 60s who had the quality of someone who said things once and meant them fully, which Eliza had come to appreciate. He loaded their order without ceremony and talked to Caleb about the winter feed situation with the focused brevity of two men who understood the same things. She was tying down the back of the wagon when she heard it, not directed at her. Two men talking near the livery, far enough away that they were not aware they could be heard, close enough that she couldn't not hear. Heard he's got 4 of them in that house. Not a one of them his. Hell of a thing to take on. Won't last. Man gets through one winter with somebody else's 4 kids and he'll remember real quick what his life looked like before. That woman's running out the clock. Maybe she knows it. Of course she knows it. Why do you think she came out here? Nobody back home would have her. She stood behind the wagon with her hands on the rope and she let the words finish. She did not move. She counted her breaths the way she'd learned to in the months after Daniel died, when grief and panic and the cold mathematics of her situation would all arrive at once. And the only thing that helped was counting. One breath, another, another. She finished tying the wagon. She walked around to the bench and climbed up. When Caleb came out of the store, he looked at her face and said nothing for a moment. He climbed up and took the reins. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing I didn't already know people were saying." "Tell me anyway." She told him. Not the voices. She didn't look at the men by the livery and she wasn't going to. But the words, repeated flatly, the way you repeat something you want out of your head by giving it to someone else. Caleb listened. He drove. The horses moved through the snow at the unhurried pace that was the only pace available in these conditions. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Which part bothered you most?" The question surprised her. She thought about it honestly. "The part about running out the clock," she said, "because it assumes I came here deceiving you, and I didn't." "I know that. I counted 4 children at your gate before you could invite us in. A woman running out the clock doesn't do that." "I know," he said again. "The other part—" She stopped, started again. "The other part is just a thing people say. I've been hearing it since Daniel died. It doesn't—" She stopped again. "It doesn't not land," Caleb said. "No, it doesn't not land." He drove. The snow stretched out in every direction, flat and white and enormous. The sky above it, the pale uniform gray of a day that had decided not to commit to anything. "You know what I've heard," Caleb said, "since you arrived." "I can guess. Probably. But what I haven't heard, what nobody has said to me, not once, is that I look like a man who made a mistake." He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the road ahead. "Because I don't think I look like that. And I think the people watching us can tell." She didn't say anything. "The ones at the livery," he said. "They're not watching us. They're talking about an idea of us. There's a difference." She looked out at the white landscape and thought about the difference between an idea of something and the actual thing, and how much of her life she had spent being the idea of something, the widow, the burden, the woman with too many children, and how rarely anyone had looked past the idea to the actual. She thought about a man at a table built for 6, waiting. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For saying it that way." He didn't respond to that, just drove, and she let the silence settle between them, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have been in the same weather together long enough to not need to narrate it. Samuel overheard them in town. She didn't know it at the time. She found out 3 days later from Thomas, who had found out from Clara, who had apparently been told by Samuel himself in one of the confessional exchanges that siblings conduct in the dark, after lights out, when the adults are downstairs, and things can be said that can't be said in daylight. Samuel had not been at the livery. He had been at Hendrix's store, waiting with Thomas and Clara near the entrance while the adults handled the order, and the 2 men talking near the livery had been close enough to the store's open door that Samuel, who had a 9-year-old's ability to pick up anything that was not meant for him, had heard most of what they said. She found out on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind with no particular warning attached to it. She was looking for Samuel to send him to wash before supper and couldn't find him in the house, which should not have been alarming in itself, except that it was cold and dark and the barn was already settled for the night. And when she stuck her head in the barn, Thomas said he hadn't seen him since after lunch. That was 3 hours ago. She came back into the house and stood in the kitchen and did the rapid inventory of the situation. His coat was gone, his boots, the small canvas sack he'd carried off the wagon the first day and kept under his bed since. She checked under his bed. The sack was gone. She stood up slowly. She felt the panic arrive, not the sharp, blinding kind, but the deep, cold kind, the kind that goes into your bones and stays there, the kind that feels like the floor has simply failed to be where it was a moment ago. She went back to the kitchen. She looked at the dark window. Caleb came in from the yard and saw her face and stopped. "Samuel," she said. He was already moving to get his coat. "His bag is gone," she said. "The small canvas one." "How long?" "Thomas says since after lunch, 3 hours, maybe a little more." He was already at the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. "I need you to stay here with the other 3. "I know." She pressed her fist against her sternum, the place where the cold panic had settled. "Caleb." He looked at her. "He went because he heard those men in town," she said. "I don't know how much he heard, but he heard enough. He thinks—" Her voice held barely. "He thinks if he goes, the rest of us have a better chance. That's what he thinks." Something moved through Caleb's face. Not alarm exactly. The alarm was there, but it was behind something harder and more settled, something that looked like a man who has made a decision and has no intention of revisiting it. "I know what he thinks," he said. "I'll find him." He went. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went and checked the fire and put Thomas in charge of Rose and told Clara to stay inside, and she came back to the kitchen window and watched the dark. The temperature was falling. She could tell by the way the window had started to run with frost at the edges, and by the sound of the wind which had shifted from the west, the wind that meant straightforward cold, to the north, which was the wind that meant serious cold, the kind that could move through a coat and a shirt and into your skin in less time than it seemed possible. She knew this because Caleb had told her 2 weeks earlier the way he told her the practical things about Wyoming winters. Without drama, because drama was not useful, just information delivered in the tone of a man who respected the land enough to take it seriously. She stood at the window and thought about Samuel in that cold. He was smart. He was careful, the way Caleb had said. He watched everything before he tried it. He didn't rush. But he was 9 years old and he was running on grief, and the particular logic of a child who had decided that self-sacrifice was the most useful contribution he could make, and smart and careful would only carry him so far against a Wyoming night in December. She thought about everything she'd said to him over the years, every time she'd tried to tell him he didn't have to carry it, that he was a child and the weight was not his weight to carry. He had listened the way he listened to everything, carefully, politely, and without any indication that he intended to change his behavior. She thought about Caleb riding out into the dark, without hesitation, without counting the cost first, or asking whether the return was worth it, or calculating what he was owed and what he wasn't, just gone, with his coat and his horse, and the particular determination of a man who had made a decision. She had watched enough men make decisions to know the difference between the ones who decided and the ones who performed deciding. She had watched her husband Daniel make decisions, good ones mostly, but decisions that always had a breath of hesitation in them, a fraction of a second where he was checking the calculation. She had watched Roy Monroe make decisions with the smooth confidence of someone who had never genuinely doubted that his own interests were the organizing principle of any situation. She had not watched Caleb Whitaker hesitate at all. He found him an hour and 40 minutes later. She knew the time because she had been counting it, which was the only thing that felt useful to do. The counting of time in a situation where time was the variable that mattered most. An hour of cold was survivable. 2 hours was serious. 3 hours was where the variables began to compound in ways you couldn't manage. She heard the horse before she heard anything else. The sound of hooves on frozen ground, irregular, slower than a normal pace. The the sound of a horse carrying extra weight and being asked to move carefully. She was at the door before Caleb reached the porch. He came up the steps with Samuel in his arms. Not unconscious, she could see that immediately, and the relief of it went through her like something physical. Samuel was awake, his face pressed against Caleb's coat, his eyes open but half-lidded. The dazed look of someone who has been very cold and is only beginning to understand the full extent of it. He was wrapped in Caleb's coat, which meant Caleb had been riding back in his shirt in December, and his face and the back of his hands were reddened with the kind of cold that didn't go away quickly. "Get the blankets near the fire," Caleb said. Practical, steady, the voice of a man who was managing several things at once and needed the next thing done now. She had them already. She had had them near the fire for the past hour. Caleb carried Samuel to the main room and knelt down and set him near the fire, and she wrapped the blankets around him, and Clara and Thomas had come in from the kitchen doorway without being asked, and were standing very still, the way children stand when something real has happened and they understand, without being told, that the thing to do is to be still and not add anything to the situation. Samuel looked at his mother. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was thin. "We'll talk later," she said. "Not now. Be warm first." He nodded. His eyes went to Caleb, who was behind her, his shirt damp with cold, already going to the stove for the reason that a man returning from cold needs something hot, and will get it himself rather than ask. "You're mad," Samuel said. "Not a question." Caleb looked at him over his shoulder from across the room. "I'm cold," he said, "and I'm tired, and my horse is tired." He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there holding it. "We can be mad later too if you want. Tonight we're just going to be warm." Samuel looked at him. "Okay," Caleb said. Samuel nodded slowly. Caleb sat down in the chair nearest the stove, not the one at the head of the table, just the nearest chair, and drank his coffee, and Samuel lay wrapped in blankets by the fire, and the room was very quiet for a while. The only sounds the fire and the wind outside, and Rose occasionally making the small investigating sound she made in the night. Eliza sat on the floor beside Samuel. She didn't touch him, because sometimes he needed proximity without contact, and she had learned that about him a long time ago. She just sat near him. After a while, Clara came and sat on her other side. Then Thomas, who sat down without ceremony and immediately fell asleep against Eliza's shoulder, which was Thomas's particular way of declaring a crisis resolved. She heard them talking in the morning. She had slept badly and woken early and come downstairs before anyone else, or so she thought. But the murmur of voices from near the fire reached her on the stairs, and she stopped. Caleb. Samuel. The low cadences of two people having a conversation that has already been going on for a while. She sat down on the third stair from the bottom and listened. "What you heard those men say," Caleb was saying, "was their opinion of a situation they don't live in. You understand the difference?" A pause. Samuel's voice, quieter. "They said you'd remember what your life looked like before." "I have a good memory," Caleb said. "I remember what my life looked like before fine. It looked like a quiet house with 6 chairs." A pause. "I don't remember it fondly." Silence for a moment. "They said my mother came out here because nobody back home would have her." The silence that followed was longer. "Your mother came out here," Caleb said, "because she made a decision. On her own, with 4 kids, and nothing but her own nerve. She wrote letters, and she was honest in them, and she got on a train and she crossed 600 miles to start again. That's not a woman nobody wanted." His voice was even, deliberate. "That's a woman who decided she was worth more than what she was being offered." Samuel was quiet. Then, "You really don't think she's a burden?" "Do you think you're a burden?" Caleb said. A pause. "Sometimes." "And are you?" Samuel didn't answer right away. Then, "I help with the water." "You do," Caleb said. "You help with the water, and you check the north fence with me, and you're the only one in this family who doesn't talk at me before I've had coffee." A pause. "That last one is worth more than you know." She heard something that might have been a breath of a laugh from Samuel. A small one. Reluctant. "Here's what I need you to understand," Caleb said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Less conversational, more direct, the voice he used when he was saying something that he needed to say once and mean fully. "When I rode out last night, I wasn't doing you a favor. I wasn't doing it because I'm a good man or because it was the right thing. I did it because this is my house, and you are in my house, and what happens to you while you're in my house is my responsibility. That's not a burden. That's just how it is. A pause. You understand? Silence. Samuel. Yes, Samuel said, very quiet. You ever pull something like that again, Caleb said, and I will be the one who's angry. Not tired, not cold, angry. We clear? Yes. All right. She heard the stove, the clink of a cup. Then Samuel said, so quietly she almost missed it, what do I call you? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Whatever you want, Caleb said. There's no requirement. Thomas calls you Caleb. He does. Clara doesn't call you anything yet. She'll figure it out. Another pause. She pressed her hand against the wall beside her on the stairs, the cold plaster against her palm. I don't want to call you Caleb, Samuel said. Caleb did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice had that particular quality it got when he was managing something he hadn't expected to need to manage, something that had arrived without warning and required him to be steadier than he'd prepared to be. Okay, he said. Not yet, Samuel said. Okay, maybe later. Whenever you're ready, Caleb said. Or never, if that's how it goes. No requirement. She heard Samuel shift. Then, she cried, you know. When you were out looking for me, she didn't want us to see, but Thomas came in for water and he saw. I figured, Caleb said. She doesn't cry usually. No, she doesn't. That means it was real bad. It was cold and it was dark, and you were 9 years old in it, Caleb said. Yeah, it was real bad. Pause. I didn't mean to make her cry. I know you didn't. I thought it would be better if I... He stopped. I know what you thought, Caleb said. And the thinking made sense with what you knew and what you heard. But what you know now is different. A pause. You see that? Yes, Samuel said. Good. Eliza sat on the stair for a long moment after that. Then she stood up quietly and went back up to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the gray early light. She sat there until she heard Thomas coming down the stairs with his particular heavy-footed morning tread, calling for breakfast before he was even in the kitchen. Then she got up and went down to start it. She came into the kitchen and Samuel was at the table with his hands around a cup of warmed milk, and Caleb was at the stove, and neither of them indicated by any expression or gesture that they'd been talking, or that she might have heard any part of it, and she did not indicate it either. I'll do the eggs, she said. Coffee's ready, Caleb said, and moved aside. She poured a cup and stood beside him at the stove, and the warmth of it came up around them both. And outside the north wind was still moving across the frozen land, and inside the fire was going, and Thomas was already making noise, and Rose was awake, and Clara was coming down the stairs with a drawing she wanted to show someone. The table was full. Every chair was full, and the north wind could say what it wanted, and the men at the livery could count what they wanted to count. And somewhere down in Missouri, Roy Monroe probably still believed that eventually she'd run out of options and come back to accept what he'd offered. She stood at the stove and drank her coffee. She had run out of options once, and what she'd found at the end of them was a man who rode out in his shirt in a December night for a child who hadn't yet decided what to call him. She thought that was worth more than anyone who hadn't been there would ever really understand. The week after Samuel came home from the cold, nobody talked about it directly. That was the Whitaker Ranch way Eliza had come to understand. Not avoidance exactly, more like the practical understanding that some things didn't need to be narrated in order to be true. The night had happened. Caleb had ridden out. Samuel had come back wrapped in someone else's coat. The table had been full the next morning and the morning after that, and the fact of the fullness was its own kind of statement, more complete than anything that could have been said about it. What changed was Samuel, not dramatically. Not in the way of a boy who had experienced something and emerged from it transformed into a different person. That was not how Samuel worked, and anyone who knew him could have told you that. What changed was something in the grain of him, something below the surface, the way wood changes after it's been through water and dried again. Harder in some places, more flexible in others. Not the same as before. He still watched. He still kept his own counsel in the way he always had. But the watching had changed quality. It was less the watching of a sentry and more the watching of someone who had already made a judgment and was now simply paying attention because the world was interesting and he wanted to know things. He started asking questions, not the careful, strategic questions he'd been asking Caleb in the barn, the ones designed to test the answers against a standard he wasn't disclosing. These were different, genuine questions, the kind children ask when they've decided the person they're asking is worth asking. Why did the north pasture fence need different posts than the south? What happened to cattle in a bad winter if the feed ran short? How did you know when an animal was sick versus just tired? Caleb answered all of them in the same tone he used to answer Thomas's horse questions, directly, without simplifying, with the occasional follow-up question of his own that made Samuel think rather than just receive information. It was, Eliza realized, the way you talk to someone you've decided is capable of more than you initially assumed. She watched it happening from whatever distance the house provided, and she let it happen without commentary, which was possibly the most difficult thing she had managed since arriving in Wyoming. The letter arrived in January. Caleb brought it in from the post with the other mail, a seed catalog, a notice from a feed supplier, an envelope with the return address of a law office in Cheyenne that made him set the seed catalog down before he'd finished looking at it. He read it standing at the kitchen counter. His face did not change significantly, but something tightened in his jaw, and when he set the letter down and looked at Eliza, it was with the particular expression of a man who has just been handed a complication he had not been expecting and is deciding, in real time, how much of it to share. "What is it?" she said. He handed her the letter. It was from a lawyer named Aldous Fitch, writing on behalf of a man named Gerald Crail, who described himself as the adjacent landowner to the northeast, and claimed that the Whitaker property line, as currently fenced, encroached on approximately 40 acres of land that was rightfully his under a survey conducted per the letter 18 months prior. Mr. Crail requested that the encroaching fence be relocated at Mr. Whitaker's expense within 60 days, or he would pursue the matter through the appropriate legal channels in Cheyenne. She read it twice. "Is it true?" she said. "The encroachment?" "No." He said it flat, without hesitation. "That land has been mine for 11 years. The original survey put the line exactly where the fence is. Crail bought his property 3 years ago from a man who was selling off pieces of a larger holding, and ever since then he's been finding reasons to say the boundaries are wrong. Has he done this before? He filed a complaint with the county last spring. Nothing came of it because nothing could come of it. The survey was done right." He picked up the letter and looked at it again. "But a Cheyenne lawyer means he's decided to spend real money on it this time." She sat down at the table. "How much land is 40 acres? "The northeast pasture and the water access that goes with it. Without that water, the north herd loses their closest source by about 3 miles. He set the letter down. "It's not the acreage, it's the water." She understood that immediately, the way she'd come to understand ranch arithmetic over the past months. Not academically, but practically. The way you understand things when they are the conditions of your actual life. Water was not a convenience out here. Water was the difference between viable and not. "What do you need to do?" she said. He looked at her. She had learned to recognize this particular look of his, the one he got when she said something that landed differently than he'd expected, when her response moved in a direction he hadn't anticipated and he was adjusting. "I need to find the original survey documents," he said, "and probably get a lawyer of my own." "Where are the survey documents?" "They should be in the county records office in Harlow, copies at least. I have the originals here somewhere." "Then we find the originals first. Tonight, before anything else." He was quiet for a moment. He said. "Is there a reason I shouldn't help with this?" He looked at her for another moment, and she held the look without filling the silence, which was something she'd learned from him. Then he said, "No, there's no reason." They spent the evening going through the box of papers Caleb kept in the back of the bedroom closet, the compressed documentary history of 11 years of ranch ownership, the kind of accumulated paperwork that a man keeps because he knows it matters, but doesn't look at because nothing has required him to. Deeds, receipts, invoices, correspondence with suppliers, a folded map of the property lines that Caleb spread on the table and studied with Samuel appearing silently at his elbow, as if he'd been there for the whole conversation. "You shouldn't be up," Eliza said. "I heard the word lawyer," Samuel said, without looking up from the map. Caleb glanced at him sideways. "Go to bed." "I'm not in the way." "Samuel." "I can read a map," Samuel said. "Thomas can't. I can." Caleb looked at the boy, then at the map. Then he pulled out the chair beside him and Samuel sat in it, and the two of them bent over the map together with the original survey document Caleb had found in the second folder, comparing lines and measurements in the low lamplight, and Eliza went back to sorting the rest of the box. She found the deed near the bottom, beneath a stack of receipts from a sawmill. She set it beside the survey document, and the three of them looked at it together. And even she, with no particular expertise in property law, could see that the survey line and the current fence line were the same line, and that the land Crail was claiming was inside the boundary that the deed had established 11 years prior. "He knows this," Caleb said. "Crail's not stupid. He knows the documents exist." "Then why file?" she said. "Because documents have to be produced, and lawyers in Cheyenne cost money. And some men calculate that the other man will find it easier to move a fence than to fight." He looked at the deed. "He's wrong about that calculation." "Do you know a lawyer?" she said. "There's a man in Harlow who does land work. Name is Reardon. He's not fancy, but he knows Wyoming land law." "Then you go to Reardon in the morning," she said, "and you take all of this." She indicated the survey document and the deed. "And you don't wait for 60 days. Caleb looked at her again with that adjusting look. "You're not worried," he said. "Most people would be worried." "I'm worried," she said. "Worrying quietly while making a plan is still worrying." Samuel, who had been listening to all of this with the focused intensity he brought to anything he'd decided mattered, said, "What happens if the lawyer in Cheyenne is better than the lawyer in Harlow?" "Then we find a better lawyer," Caleb said. "How much does that cost?" "Samuel," Eliza said. "It's a real question," Caleb said without heat. He looked at the boy. "More than I'd like, but less than losing the water access." He folded the survey document with care. "Some things you pay for because the alternative is worse. That's just math." Samuel considered this. "My father used to say that," he said. Then, as if he hadn't meant to say it, "About the farm. Before." The kitchen went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when Daniel was brought into the room. Not painfully, not anymore, but with the weight of a real presence being acknowledged. "He was right," Caleb said. Straightforward, no ceremony. Just confirmed the dead man's wisdom and moved on, which was exactly the right thing. And the fact that he knew it was exactly the right thing said something about him that Eliza put in the same private collection as all the other things. Reardon turned out to be a thin, precise man in his 50s with a filing system that appeared chaotic and functioned perfectly, the kind of professional organization that looks like disorder until you need something and it appears immediately. He looked at the survey document and the deed for about 4 minutes, and then he looked at Caleb and said, "Crail's lawyer knows this case doesn't hold. What he's betting is that you won't want to pay to prove it." "He's wrong," Caleb said. "Good. Then we respond to the letter and we file the original survey with the county, and we make it clear that you will pursue this in Cheyenne if he does." Reardon set the documents down. 9 times in 10, that ends it. "What's the 10th time?" "The 10th time, a man has a reason that isn't really about the land." Reardon looked at him levelly. "Is there anything else between you and Crail I should know about?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He offered to buy the northeast pasture 2 years ago. I said no." "How did he take that?" "Like a man who isn't used to hearing no." Reardon picked up his pen. "Then we prepare for the 10th time." Eliza had come with Caleb that morning, not because he'd asked her to, but because she'd said she was coming, and he hadn't said she wasn't, which was the method of negotiation they'd arrived at for things that didn't warrant a direct conversation but needed to be decided. She sat beside Caleb in Reardon's office and listened and asked 2 questions. About the timeline for a Cheyenne filing, and about what the county records office held versus what Reardon would need her to provide. And Reardon answered both with the same precision he applied to everything, and Caleb watched her ask without expression, but she could feel that he was watching and she had stopped being self-conscious about it. On the way back to the ranch, Caleb said, "You've dealt with something like this before." "Not land law, but men who think the other person will fold if they apply enough pressure?" "Yes." He didn't ask who. She hadn't offered it, and he had the intelligence not to push on things that hadn't been offered. But something in her said it was time. Not everything, not all of it, but enough. "Roy Monroe," she said. He waited. "Daniel's brother." She looked at the road ahead. The sky was the pale winter blue that happened on clear, cold days, the kind of blue that was beautiful and meant nothing good about the temperature. After Daniel died, Roy came to me with what he called an offer. I'd come to his house, run his household, and he'd provide income and shelter for me and the children. Not his family, Caleb said. A statement. He didn't say it directly. He never said anything directly. But no, not his family. Did he know you understood what he was actually offering? Yes. I think he was curious whether I'd pretend not to. She adjusted the blanket across her lap. I said no. He said I should think about what alternatives I had. I said no again. He said I'd come back to him when I'd exhausted the other options. Is that what brought you here? Exhausted options. She thought about how to answer that. The options I exhausted were the ones that required me to be less than what I am, she said. Writing to the agency and writing to you, that was a different kind of option. That was making one. He drove for a while. The horses moved through the cold at their reliable pace. Monroe, he said, is he the kind of man who stays in Missouri or the kind who follows up on things? He's the kind who believes he's patient enough to win. You think he'll reach out? I think he already knows where I am. Roy is methodical. He'd have found out. She looked at the road. I don't think he'll come here. He doesn't do things that look messy. A man traveling to Wyoming to make a claim on another man's household looks messy. But a letter. A letter is possible. She paused. I should have told you this before now. Why didn't you? Because it felt like adding one more thing to count. She said it plainly, because he was a man who deserved plain. I've been aware since the day I arrived of how many things I came with, and I've been trying to... She stopped, started again. I've been trying to make sure I was worth what I came with before I added more to it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's a terrible way to live. I know, she said. You don't have to earn your way into this house, Eliza. You live in it. She heard that sentence in the same way she'd heard the ones before it, not as a declaration of feeling, not as the kind of thing a man said to be generous, but as a statement of a condition he considered already established, already true. You live in it. Present tense, not contingent. She looked at the pale blue sky. I know that now, she said. The letter from Roy Monroe arrived on a Thursday in February, which was how she knew Caleb had been right about him. Methodical, patient, timing things with the deliberateness of someone who believed in the value of letting situations ripen before he applied pressure. It was addressed to her, which was correct in form, but Caleb was the one who brought the mail in, and he set it on the table in front of her without a word, which meant he'd seen the return address and had already made a decision about how to handle this, and the decision was that it was hers. She read it. Roy had found the phrasing of a concerned family member, which was the voice she'd expected. He hoped she was well. He hoped the children were well. He had been thinking of her situation and wanted to make sure she understood that his previous offer remained open should the arrangement in Wyoming prove less suitable than she'd anticipated. He was sure she was doing her best. He hoped the man she'd married understood what he'd taken on. He included a line about Daniel, how Daniel would have wanted her to be safe, how Daniel had always been sensible about practical matters. And that line was the one that was designed to hurt, and it did, because it used a true thing as a weapon. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the table. Caleb was watching her. Not intrusively. He was on the other side of the kitchen, and he had his own coffee, and he had not moved, but watching. He's not threatening anything, she said. I know, that's how he operates. You read it? The first line in the return address. I didn't need to read further to know the shape of it. She looked at the folded letter. He uses Daniel. He says Daniel would have wanted me to be practical. Daniel married you, Caleb said. That seems like its own answer. She looked at him. A man who marries a woman has already told you what he thought she was worth, Caleb said. Monroe using a dead man's name to make a different argument about the same woman's worth is... He stopped. Chose his words with the care he used when he was trying not to say something more than he intended. It's not honest reasoning. No, she said. It's not. Do you want to write back to him? I need to think about what to say. Take the time. He looked at his coffee. But if it would help to know, whatever you write, You're writing from here, from this house. Not as a woman who's deciding whether to leave or stay. She held that for a moment. You're saying the decision is already made. I'm saying it was already made a while ago, and neither of us made a production of it, which is probably how it should have gone. He looked at her directly. But if it needed to be said plainly, I'm saying it. She thought about the 6 chairs. She thought about oatmeal on the stove. She thought about a man in his shirt in a December night, and a baby who had decided all on her own what to call him. It needed to be said plainly, she said. All right, then it's said. She wrote to Roy Monroe that evening. Not a long letter. She thanked him for his concern and told him she was well and the children were well and that the arrangement in Wyoming was not a temporary one and that Daniel would have been satisfied because Daniel had always believed she was capable of more than the options currently in front of her, and she had found a larger option. She did not mention Caleb by name. She did not need to. The letter said what it needed to say, which was that the door Roy Monroe believed he was holding open had been closed from the other side, and she was the one who had closed it. Caleb read it when she was done, because she asked him to, not for approval, but because 2 sets of eyes on something that mattered was better than one. He read it and handed it back and said, "That's right. Just that." She sealed it and put it by the door and in the morning. Samuel took it to post without being asked, because he had apparently been paying attention to the whole thing in the way he paid attention to everything, and he understood without being told that the letter going out promptly was the point. Well, the spring came the way springs come in Wyoming, not all at once, but in the slow relaxation of a land that had been clenched tight against the cold for months. The ground softened. The light changed quality, turning from the flat white of winter to something warmer and more directional, a light that picked out details and threw shadows and made the world look specific again rather than general. Eliza planted her garden. She had planned it since November, through the winter months when the frozen ground made the planning theoretical, drawing rough maps on the backs of letters and thinking about what the soil would hold and what the season was long enough for and what the children would actually eat versus what they would push to the edges of their plates and regard with suspicion. She started with the practical: onions, potatoes, carrots, beans, and then she allowed herself the things that were not only practical: herbs near the kitchen door, a row of sunflowers along the south fence that Thomas had specifically requested because he said Juniper liked them. She wasn't sure horses particularly liked sunflowers, but she planted the row anyway. Caleb built her the raised beds she'd sketched in November, without ceremony, appearing one Saturday with lumber and the focused expression of a man measuring twice, and she hadn't asked him for it. The beds appeared at the end of the day, and he came in for supper and said nothing about them, and she said nothing about them except thank you, and he said yep, and that was the entire exchange. Clara drew them. Of course she did. Clara drew everything that held still long enough, and a raised garden bed was significantly more cooperative as a subject than Juniper. The drawing went up on the kitchen wall beside the one she'd done of the barn, and Caleb looked at it on the morning she put it up and said, "The proportions are right," which Clara received with the particular stillness of someone who has been told the thing they most wanted to hear. Thomas planted 3 of the sunflowers himself, with his tongue pressed to his upper lip and the absolute concentration of a child performing a task he's decided is important. He patted the soil down over each one with both palms and then stood up and looked at them with the satisfaction of someone surveying completed work. "They need water," Eliza said. "I know," Thomas said, and went to get the bucket with the manner of a man who had anticipated this requirement. She watched him haul the bucket across the yard. Slightly too heavy for him, but he refused to fill it less than full, which was Thomas in all things. And she thought about the boy who had climbed down from Hollis's wagon 6 months ago, quiet and careful, touching nothing that wasn't offered. The boy who was now hauling water for his sunflowers with the proprietorial confidence of someone tending his own land. She thought, this is what belonging looks like when it takes. Samuel turned 10 in March. She had been planning it since January, in the quiet way she planned things. Not elaborate, because elaborate wasn't the kind of household they were, but marked, because she believed in marking the things that mattered. A cake, which she'd been collecting the ingredients for over several weeks. A new pair of work gloves, because his old ones had worn through at the fingers. A book. She'd found it in the general store in Harlow, a history of the American frontier that she'd picked up and immediately known was right. because it was the kind of book that assumed the reader was serious and didn't talk down. She'd mentioned the birthday to Caleb in passing, not expecting anything. On the morning of Samuel's birthday, before breakfast, Caleb had said to Samuel, "Come to the barn with me." Samuel had gone, with the wary, cooperative expression he'd adopted for these invitations. Not resistant anymore, just careful about expecting things, which was its own kind of progress. He came back 15 minutes later. He came back different. She noticed it immediately, the way she noticed everything about her oldest son. Something loosened in his face, in the set of his shoulders, something that had been held tightly for a long time that had, in the past 15 minutes, been allowed to exist differently. She looked at the door, then at Samuel. "What is it?" He looked at her. His expression was the complicated one he got when a feeling was moving through him that he hadn't categorized yet. "Caleb's teaching me to ride," he said. "Not Thomas style, where you just sit on a horse and go. Actually ride. He said we'd start today." A pause. "He said I was old enough." She waited. "He also said—" Samuel stopped, swallowed, looked somewhere past her left shoulder. "He said that when a man can ride the full property line alone, he knows the land is partly his to look after." He looked back at her. "He said he'd teach me to ride it." She kept her face even. She was very good at this when she needed to be. "That's a big thing," she said. "I know. You think you can do it?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been slightly insulted by an easy question. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Breakfast first." He sat down at the table. He ate his breakfast with the same downward focus he always had, but she could see from the way he held himself that something had shifted in his center of gravity, less braced, less preemptively defended. A boy who has been told that the land is partly his to look after sits differently than a boy who is still deciding whether to unpack. She brought the cake out after supper. Clara had decorated it in her particular way, not chaotically, but with the precise aesthetic sensibility that showed up in everything she did. Small patterns pressed into the frosting with a fork. Thomas had, at some point during the afternoon, gone and picked what he claimed were wildflowers, but were mostly dried seed stalks with a few scrubby early-season blooms mixed in, and arranged them in a cup on the table. Caleb had found, somewhere, a small hunting knife in a leather sheath. Good quality, the kind of thing that would last, and set it beside Samuel's plate without explanation. Samuel looked at it, looked at Caleb. "That's a real knife," he said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Not a child's one." "You're 10, Caleb said. 10 is old enough for a real one if you're careful with it, and you're the most careful person in this household, including me." Samuel picked it up, held it, set it down, picked it up again. He didn't say thank you right away. He sat with the knife in his hands for a moment, the way he sat with things he didn't know what to do with yet, carefully, feeling the weight of them. Then he said, "Thank you." And then he said quieter, looking at the knife rather than at Caleb, "Pa." The kitchen went very still. Not dramatically. The fire was still going. Rose was still in her chair, redistributing pieces of cake across her tray with the methodical focus of a baby with a project. Thomas was looking at Samuel with enormous eyes. Clara had gone very still with her fork halfway to her mouth. Caleb looked at Samuel. He looked at him for a long moment, the full, unhurried look he gave to things he wanted to be sure about, to things he wanted to get right. Then he said, "Yeah," in the same tone he used for most things, quiet, direct, not making it bigger than it was, and not making it smaller. Samuel nodded. He cut his cake. Eliza looked at her plate. She stayed looking at it until she was sure her face had resolved into something she was comfortable with people seeing, and then she looked up and the supper table was still there, and all 6 chairs were still full, and Thomas was already negotiating with Clara for a corner piece, and Caleb was drinking his coffee, and Samuel was eating his cake with the focused calm of someone who has done something that cost him a great deal and has decided it was worth it. She thought about the day she'd stood at the gate counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. She had counted them like a toll, like an admission of a deficit, like the number that would make a man calculate and then decline. She had learned to say it fast, like pulling a splinter, because the anticipation was worse than the outcome. She had been wrong about what the number meant, not wrong about the counting. The counting had been necessary, had been honest, but wrong about what it added up to. She had been counting losses, deficits, reasons for rejection. Caleb Whitaker had looked at the same four and seen something else entirely. She thought about that. About how two people could look at the same number and arrive at completely different sums. Outside, the Wyoming spring was making its slow, insistent argument against the winter. And in the kitchen, the fire was going, and Rose was redistributing cake, and Samuel was turning the hunting knife over in his hands between bites, with the expression of someone examining a good decision. And Caleb was watching all of it with the particular stillness of a man who has received something he had stopped expecting and is making sure it's real before he lets himself believe it completely. She understood that feeling. She understood it precisely. Reardon's letter to Crail's lawyer went out in the first week of February, and the response came back in 3 weeks, which was, Reardon said, faster than he'd expected, and faster responses in land disputes usually meant one of two things. The other side had realized their position was weaker than they'd presented it, or they had decided to escalate before the opposing party had time to prepare. This one was neither. Crail's lawyer wrote back to say that his client was willing to discuss the matter directly, man to man, without further legal involvement, and proposed a meeting at the Harlow County office on a date in late February. Reardon read the letter to Caleb and Eliza in his office, and then set it down and said, "He's repositioning. The Cheyenne filing would have required him to produce his own survey, and I suspect that survey has problems he'd rather not have examined in a formal proceeding. So he wants to settle," Caleb said. "He wants to look like he's settling. There's a difference." Reardon folded the letter. "My recommendation is that you go to the meeting. Take your documents. Let him propose something. Don't agree to anything in the room. And if he proposes something reasonable, then we discuss it afterward and you decide. But in my experience, men like Crail don't propose reasonable things in the first meeting. They propose things that sound reasonable and aren't." He looked at Caleb steadily. "You've been dealing with this man for 2 years. You know him better than I do." Caleb looked at the folded letter. "He'll offer to drop the claim in exchange for something. Access rights, grazing rights on the northeast pasture, something that looks like nothing but adds up to a foothold." "That's my read," Reardon said. "Then we go and we hear it and we say we'll think about it." Yes. Eliza had been listening to this exchange the way she listened to most things, without inserting herself until there was a reason to, which was a discipline she'd developed not from passivity, but from the understanding that listening completely was more useful than speaking partially. She said, "Is there anything he could offer that would actually be worth taking?" Both men looked at her. "I'm asking seriously," she said. 11 years of a boundary dispute is 11 years of a boundary dispute. If there's something he could give that would close it permanently, that might be worth knowing before you walk into the room." Reardon looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eliza. Then he said, "Written withdrawal. Recorded with the county. No access rights, no grazing rights, no future claims based on the same survey." "Then that's what you ask for," she said. "Not what you'll accept. What you ask for. Start there and see what he does." Reardon smiled, not broadly, just the small, precise smile of a man who has revised his assessment of a situation upward. "That's the right approach," he said. Caleb said nothing, but he looked at her with the look she had come to recognize as his version of agreement, which was simply the absence of disagreement combined with a slight shift in posture, as if he was settling his weight onto something that had proven solid. The meeting with Crail happened on a gray February morning in the county office, which was a single room in a building that also housed the land registrar and smelled permanently of old paper and wood smoke. Crail turned out to be a man in his mid-50s with the particular bearing of someone who had made money and believed the money had also made him right about things. He had his lawyer with him, a compact man named Birch, who said little and watched everything. Caleb had Reardon. Eliza sat beside Caleb. Crail looked at her when they came in. The look was brief and evaluating, the kind that sizes up an unexpected element without wanting to appear to do so. He said nothing about her presence. Neither did his lawyer. They had all apparently decided to proceed as if the configuration of the opposing party was unremarkable, which Eliza found mildly satisfying. Crail opened by saying he was a reasonable man who preferred practical solutions to expensive legal proceedings. He said the survey discrepancy was a genuine one that had caused his own planning difficulties. He said he understood that Whitaker had held the land for many years under the existing understanding of the boundary, and he respected that continuity. He said, with the smooth delivery of someone who had prepared this, that he was willing to drop the current claim in exchange for a recorded easement granting his cattle access to the water on the northeast pasture during the summer months. He said it like it was a small thing. Reardon looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the table. Then Caleb said, "No." Crail's expression adjusted slightly. The easement would be limited in scope. An easement recorded with the county isn't limited in scope, Caleb said. It's permanent. The next man who owns your land has the same access. The man after him. An easement is a permanent document, and I'm not signing one. Whitaker, be reasonable. I am being reasonable, Caleb said. The survey my land was deeded on 11 years ago puts the fence line where the fence is. You've had a lawyer file a claim that your own lawyer knows won't survive a formal proceeding in Cheyenne, which is why we're in this room instead of a courtroom. He looked at Crail directly. I'll settle this today. Written withdrawal of the claim, recorded with the county, no easements, no access rights, no future claims based on the 18-month survey. In exchange, I don't countersue for the cost of the legal response you've made me generate. Birch, the other lawyer, looked at his own hands. Crail's expression had moved from the smooth reasonableness of the opening position to something less managed. Not anger exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has had their actual position named accurately in public and finds the experience unpleasant. There was a silence. Then Crail said, "I'll need to discuss it with my counsel." "Take the time you need," Caleb said. He and Eliza and Reardon stepped outside into the cold February air, and Reardon said quietly, "That went better than expected." And Caleb said nothing, and Eliza thought about the men at the livery in December who had said she was running out the clock on a man who would eventually remember what his life looked like before. And she thought about what his life looked like now. Standing outside a county office in the cold, having just named another man's position accurately and declined to accept anything less than what was right. And she thought the men at the livery had badly miscalculated what kind of man they were talking about. Birch came out 20 minutes later and said his client would sign the withdrawal. The wedding happened in April. Not because April was particularly significant, but because April was when the ground had thawed enough that the yard was usable, and the kitchen garden had its first green showing, and the light was the kind that made everything look like it had decided to stay. Eliza had not wanted anything elaborate, and Caleb had not suggested elaborate, and so it was the justice of the peace from Harlow, a man named Dugan, who had a handshake like a board, and performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered the legal fact the important part, and the ceremony its necessary container. The children were there. Thomas stood beside Caleb in the way that Thomas attached himself to things he decided were his, which was completely and without self-consciousness. Clara stood very straight in a dress she'd asked Eliza to make from a bolt of blue cloth she'd seen in Harlow 3 weeks prior, and she held Rose on her hip with the particular practiced competence of an older sister. Samuel stood behind and to the left of Caleb, which was where he stood when he was part of something and was acknowledging it without making a statement about it. Hendricks from the feed store came because Caleb had mentioned it in passing, and Hendricks had said he'd be there, and Hendricks was a man who said things he meant. The Larsons came from 2 miles north, a couple in their 60s who had brought a jar of honey from their own hives and pressed it into Eliza's hands with the warmth of people who had decided she was all right some time ago and were glad to have the occasion to say so officially. Martha Greer from the general store came too, which surprised Eliza, and then, when she thought about it, didn't. Martha Greer had opinions about everything, which meant she also had opinions about the things that went right, and she appeared to have decided that this was one of them. She brought a preserves cake and told Eliza that the children looked healthy, which was Martha Greer's version of a blessing, and Eliza accepted it as such. Dugan said the words, Caleb said his, Eliza said hers. Dugan produced the document and they signed it, and that was the legal fact of it. And then someone, she thought it was Mrs. Larson, produced a bottle of something that passed for champagne this far from civilization, and Hendricks made a toast that was brief and sincere and slightly clumsy in the way of a man who does not make toasts but has decided this one matters, and Thomas immediately negotiated for a sip and was declined, and Samuel watched everything from his position behind and to the left of Caleb with an expression that had moved over the months from watchful assessment to something quieter and more settled that she thought might simply be called belonging. She didn't cry. She had cried at her wedding to Daniel, the full, uncomplicated tears of a young woman who was getting exactly what she'd hoped for. This was different, not lesser, just different. The way things are different when they have been earned through difficulty rather than arrived at through hope. She felt it in her chest, that warm, complicated pressure, but it stayed there, and she let it stay there, and it was enough. The Crail withdrawal was filed with the county in March, 2 weeks before the wedding. Reardon sent confirmation with a brief note that said simply, "Recorded, matter closed." Caleb put the confirmation in the box with the survey documents and the deed, in the spot where he could find it if he ever needed to, which he didn't expect to. He told Eliza about it at the kitchen table on the evening the letter arrived. She said, "Good." He said, "Yes." They had supper and the conversation moved to other things. Thomas had apparently convinced Juniper to take a piece of apple from his hand that morning and considered this a breakthrough of historic significance. And the land dispute settled into the past where it belonged. Another thing that had been weathered and was now over. That was the shape of most of what mattered, Eliza had found. It was not resolved in a single dramatic moment. It was resolved in the accumulation of days, in the doing of the next thing, and then the thing after that, in the quiet confirmation that the ground was still holding, and the table was still full, and the people around it were still choosing to be there. There was a lesson in that, she thought, though she had not lived long enough in certainty to state it without some remaining humility. The lesson was something about the difference between the story you tell yourself about what you need and what you find out you actually needed when you stop telling it. She had told herself she needed to not be a burden. She had arranged herself accordingly, counted her children before anyone else could, disclosed the number like a preemptive apology, tried to earn her way in before she let herself settle. She had spent so long preparing for rejection that she had not entirely known what to do with its absence. What she'd found, in the absence of rejection, was that she was simply herself. A woman who got up early and made coffee and planted gardens, and wrote letters that said what needed to be said, and stood in a lawyer's office in February and asked the right question. None of that had required her to be without children. None of it had required her to be less than she was. It had only required someone who could look at what she came with and see it clearly. Not as a burden, not as a liability, but as the specific and actual content of a life that had been lived hard and was still going. Caleb Whitaker was not a perfect man. She knew that more clearly with every month they shared a house. He was short-tempered when he was tired, which was more often than he'd admit. He had a stubbornness in him that occasionally shaded into pride, the kind that made him sit with a problem for 2 days longer than necessary because he didn't want to ask for help. He had a difficult relationship with his own feelings that expressed itself in the doing of tasks. He would build a thing, or fix a thing, or ride out into the cold, rather than say directly what the thing meant to him, which was both his deepest limitation and, if she was honest, one of the qualities she had come to love most about him, because his actions never lied. She was not a perfect woman. She knew that too. She carried more than she showed and showed less than she felt, and had a tendency to make decisions unilaterally when she was frightened, the way she'd managed nearly everything since Daniel died. Alone, efficiently, without asking, because asking felt like admitting she couldn't carry it. She was working on that. It was slow work. They were both slow work. That was the thing nobody told you about a real life with another person. Not the rush of beginning or the relief of resolution, but the long middle, the ongoing negotiation of two people who are imperfect in specific and incompatible ways, learning to account for each other's edges. It was not romantic. It was something better than romantic. It was the actual thing. Rose took her first steps in May. She had been threatening it for weeks, pulling herself up on furniture, standing with the unsteady confidence of someone who is committed to a plan and is still working out the details, taking one step, and then sitting down with great dignity as if she'd meant to do that. The actual first steps happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Eliza was in the garden and all the older children were somewhere else, and it was just Caleb in the kitchen, apparently, doing something with the stove. She heard it from the garden. Not words, just a sound, the particular sound of a grown man startled into making noise by something he hadn't expected. She came in through the kitchen door and found Rose standing in the middle of the floor with the triumphant expression of someone who has just won an argument, and Caleb standing near the stove looking at her with the expression he reserved for things that caught him without warning. "She walked," he said, which was unnecessary but apparently needed to be said. I see that, Eliza said. Rose, acknowledging the audience, took 3 more steps toward Eliza with the magnificent unsteadiness of a 10-month-old who has decided that falling is a problem for another time, and reached her, and grabbed her skirt, and looked up with an expression of complete self-satisfaction. Da, she said. Caleb said, I'm right here, in the tone of someone who has accepted that this is now his name and has made his peace with it. Rose turned around, released the skirt, and walked back toward him with the same magnificent unsteadiness. And he caught her when she arrived at his feet and held her up at arm's length and looked at her with the look he'd had the night in the hallway when she'd first gone quiet against his shoulder. The look of a man handling something he hadn't prepared to care about as much as he does. Eliza stood in the kitchen doorway and let herself feel it. The full weight of it, the complicated, beautiful, ordinary fact of it. She did not look away. She did not file it for later. She stood there, and she let it be real. Samuel rode the full property line for the first time in June. He went out in the early morning with Caleb's instructions and Caleb's map and the hunting knife at his belt. And he came back 2 hours later with the report that the north fence had a loose post at the second corner and the east gate latch needed replacing. He delivered this information at the breakfast table with the manner of someone completing a professional obligation, precise and unembellished, and Caleb said he'd get to the post and the latch today, and Samuel said he could do the latch himself if Caleb showed him how, and Caleb said all right. He was 10 years old. Eliza watched him eat his breakfast with the focused efficiency of a boy with things to do, and she thought about the 9-year-old who had packed a canvas sack in December and walked into a frozen night because he had decided his absence was a gift he could give. She thought about what it cost a child to arrive at that conclusion. What series of experiences, what accumulated evidence had to pile up before a child decided that his presence was the problem rather than the solution. She thought about the fact that the evidence had been wrong, not because the world had changed or because the circumstances that had produced that evidence had been reversed. The men at the livery still existed. Roy Monroe still existed. The arithmetic of public opinion about women with too many children still existed. The evidence was wrong because it was incomplete, because it had not accounted for a man who built a table for 6 and waited. There were people in the world, she had found, who looked at what you came with and calculated the cost. And there were people who looked at the same thing and calculated the possibility. The first kind were more numerous. That was simply true. The world contained more people who would look at 4 children and see a burden than people who would look at 4 children and see a family they didn't know they'd been waiting for. But the second kind existed. That was the thing she wanted her children to know, not as a lesson stated in those terms because lessons stated directly had a way of landing flat, but as something they carried in their bodies from having lived it. The second kind existed, and they were worth finding, and the way to find them was not to make yourself smaller or quieter or less than you were in order to seem like less of a risk. The way to find them was to be exactly and completely what you were, as early as possible, before too much had been invested in a performance that would have to be maintained. She had counted 4 children at a gate in Wyoming, and a man had looked past the number. That was not a thing she would ever stop being grateful for, and not a thing she would ever take as evidence that the world was kinder than it was. It was evidence simply that the right person in the right place could see what others missed, and that sometimes, if you were willing to travel far enough and be honest enough at the gate, you found them. Woke. The sunflowers came up in July. Thomas had been checking them every morning since April with the focused anxiety of someone monitoring an investment, kneeling in the dirt to look for signs of progress that a less invested observer might not have detected. Clara had drawn them twice, once as seedlings and once as they were coming into themselves, full-faced and turned toward the light, which Clara rendered with the kind of attention she gave to things she found genuinely worth studying. On the morning they opened fully, Thomas went to get Juniper. He led her by the halter along the fence line, supervised by Samuel, who had apparently been appointed to this task either by Caleb or by his own sense of responsibility. It was not entirely clear, and positioned her near the sunflower row and offered her one of the heads that had gone past its best and was beginning to fold. Juniper ate it with the expression of a horse who was reserving judgment on the whole enterprise. "She likes it," Thomas announced. "She ate it," Samuel said. "That's not the same thing." "She didn't bite me." "That's also not the same thing." Thomas patted the horse's neck with the unbothered confidence of someone whose theory has been confirmed regardless of what the evidence suggests. She likes it, he said again, and led Juniper back to the barn. Eliza was watching from the kitchen garden with her hands in the dirt, and she was laughing. A real one, unplanned, the kind that comes from somewhere below the place you control. She heard Caleb behind her before she saw him, his footstep on the packed earth, and she turned and he was watching Thomas and the horse with an expression that was doing several things at once, the way his expression sometimes did when he thought nobody was particularly watching. He's going to be a problem when he's older, Caleb said. He's a problem now, she said, but a manageable one. Thomas-sized problems are manageable. He looked at the garden. The onions need thinning. I know. She looked at them too. I'll do it this afternoon. I can do it. You have the post and the gate latch. Samuel's doing the latch. Said he didn't need me to stand there and watch him. She smiled at the onions. Is he right? Probably, Caleb said, in the tone of a man who is both mildly irritated and entirely proud. They stood in the kitchen garden together in the July morning, the sunflowers loud and yellow along the south fence, the ranch making its ordinary sounds around them. Horse, wind, the distant percussion of Samuel doing something with a latch. And Eliza thought about the word ordinary and what it meant, and how it was the thing nobody told you to want when you were young and hoping. They told you about the extraordinary, about the moments that announced themselves. Nobody told you that ordinary, achieved after years of its opposite, felt like the rarest and most valuable thing in the world. She looked at the house. Clara's drawings in the windows, visible from outside now. Caleb had not asked for them there, but he had not taken them down either, and she thought he liked them there in the way he liked most things that had quietly become part of his life, without ceremony, without the requirement of a declaration. She looked at the table visible through the kitchen window. 6 chairs, all of them used. She thought about a woman who had arrived at a gate counting reasons she would be refused, and a man who had looked past the count to what it actually contained. She thought about how neither of them had been certain, how certainty had never been the thing on offer, how the thing on offer was simply the chance to find out, to get inside the gate and eat supper and see what the morning looked like, and then the morning after that, and go on choosing, day by day, without the guarantee of anything except that they would both keep doing the work. That was what love looked like, she had decided, in its most honest and durable form. Not the feeling. The feeling came and went and was real when it was there, but the choice, made in the ordinary morning, to be present and accountable to the life you'd agreed to put the oatmeal on, to ride into the cold, to buy drawing paper and build garden beds and drive a nail into a wall for a drawing that deserves to be seen, to sit at a table full of children who did not come from your body and pass the bread and mean it. Caleb went back inside. She heard him say something to Clara, something about one of the drawings. She couldn't catch the words, just the tone of it, the unceremonious, matter-of-fact tone of a man talking to one of his children. She stayed in the garden a moment longer. The Wyoming summer spread out around the ranch in every direction, wide and demanding and indifferent in the way of large country that does not adjust itself to human preference. She had come to love it, this land. Not the way you love something comfortable, but the way you love something that is genuinely itself, that makes no pretenses, that shows you exactly what it is and requires you to decide if you can meet it. She could meet it. She had arrived not knowing that about herself, or knowing it in the way you know things about yourself in theory before life has confirmed them practically. She knew it now. She had crossed 600 miles with 4 children and declared herself at a gate, and the ground had held. She went inside. The table was set. Rose was in her chair banging the tray with a spoon she had acquired by methods no one had fully tracked. Thomas was explaining something to Samuel that Samuel was listening to with the patient expression of a boy who has decided that tolerating Thomas's explanations is part of the cost of having a brother. Clara was at her usual spot by the window with the afternoon light falling across her drawing, the scratch of the pencil, its familiar quiet background sound. Caleb was at the stove. He looked over his shoulder when she came in. He did not say anything, neither did she, but he moved slightly to make room for her at the stove, the automatic adjustment of people who have learned each other's dimensions, and she came and stood beside him, and the stew smelled like winter had never happened, and the window light was the warm gold of a July evening, and outside the sunflowers were facing the last of the sun. She thought, this is the thing I was looking for, when I was counting the ways I'd be refused. She thought, it was here the whole time, waiting to be found. The supper table held all of them, and none of the chairs were empty, and they ate together in the ordinary and extraordinary fact of a family that had assembled itself from loss and distance, and the specific courage of people who were willing to be honest at the gate. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.
Lemon, it's still fine. Heavy cream doesn't really make with some runny. Oh yeah, that's valid. But see, I'm used to hella thick yogurt, Turkish, because yogurt originates from Turkey. If you did not know, when you know it's funny is that the Chobani Greek yogurt brand is founded by a Turk too, which some people don't know. But in any case, I can't remember the reason why it was called Greek yogurt at some point, but I find that fascinating. Is it etymology? I'm not sure if that's the right word for it, but like whatever, like the derivative, like why did, you know, I do non-lactose. I say Faye. Yeah, I do like Faye. Faye is awesome. It's a good brand. Etymol et etymology. Yeah, maybe that's the word. I don't know why I'm giving it more syllables than it needs.